Vindicator FSX says, no love for old SeaCrafts? Shame. And then BRN says, Mako and SeaCrafts are two of the most commonly restored boats. No love for them? Question mark. These are two great comments talking about boats that you want to flip or restore or spend money on restoring. We want to thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. These are two great topics. I now want to talk about the SeaCraft starting off this episode. We also want to thank our show sponsor, PartsView.com, which is a parts and outboard superstore. They have outboard parts and all kinds of boat parts that you can get online at PartsView.com. They also have pre-made maintenance kits for Mercury, Suzuki, and Yamaha outboards, as well as Mercruiser. You can get a discount using the coupon codes and the link in the descriptions below. Now, when it comes to SeaCrafts, I do like a SeaCraft, and Vindicator also said, random question, what's your opinion on old Potter SeaCraft? Here you talk a lot about the Makos, which I do like a Mako. The older ones, the 80s, the 90s, great models, but I've always been a SeaCraft guy. My dad bought a 20 SeaCraft CC new in 75 and we restored it together in 2010. Boat just keeps on giving year after year. Also, the engine on my boat is a 1993 Mariner 150. It just keeps running and doesn't have any problems besides some paint fading, which for a 1993 you might have a little bit of paint fading. But if I did ever have to repower, what would you do as far as horsepower and brand? I know it won't live forever, but it sure is trying. So I do like SeaCrafts. The only thing, my main gripe about a SeaCraft is my main gripe about the Makos. The only thing I don't like is the live wells in the floors. I've never liked that on really any boat, especially those the 20s, the 21s, the 23s, those smaller boats. When you get those live wells in the floor, they just become a pain, and a lot of them can leak. We've had a 23 Mako where it was just pouring water out of the live well and down into the bilge. So they can be a problem. And then whenever you repower those older boats, like the 20 SeaCraft, where most of them have an outboard right to the transom, and then when people repower them, they want to put brackets on them. So you add the bracket, you got the live well in the floor in the back, you raise your transom, and then you put a 4-stroke engine on there, and that weight combination, like we talk about on a lot of these older models, it creates an issue with the boat, and sometimes it can throw off the ride of the boat, and you have to do other things like moving the batteries up to the front and other stuff like that. People will also put live wells up in the front as well to get that weight up to make the boat ride like it normally would. But for the most part, I think a lot of people, if you got the 20, you've got the 20 SeaCraft CC. I've seen plenty of people have a lot of success with either a Suzuki 140 or a 150. And as far as a brand goes, the horsepower, I'm saying 150-ish. You could even do a 175, maybe a 200. Usually those 4 cylinders, they're all the same weight. Just you're going to get more power out of having a 200 compared to a 150. But they ride great with the 140, so you don't really need that extra horsepower unless you're loading the boat up a lot, like your crew is heavy and you take a lot of gear with you. Then you might want to get a little bit more horsepower if you are loading it up heavy like that. But they ride great and they hold their value. Today, if you've got a 20-foot SeaCraft that's in decent shape, you're going to get 20, 30 grand for that boat. They're in a high demand type of bracket. So there's no reason why I didn't put SeaCrafts on this list. I just didn't think about putting them on there. I had to break it down to 5. But that 150 on the SeaCraft, it's going to perform really, really well. So I would stick to, that range. And as far as a brand goes, as soon as you get below the 150s, I don't have a problem with any brand. I think all of them make a 150. I know people that have Mercuries with 7,500 hours on it and a 150. I know people that have 8,000 hours on a Yamaha 150. So I've got people that have had 8,300 hours out of a Suzuki 150. So as far as the brand goes, whenever you get down to a 150 horsepower range, it's totally personal preference. It isn't like one's going to be way better than the other. Of course, you're going to have the people that are Suzuki, Mercury, or Yamaha, and they're all going to complain about each other, and they're going to say that their engine is the best. But for me, like I said, I know people that have 75, 8,000 hours on these engines across the board. Don't know a lot of people that have a lot of Hondas. I live in South Florida. That's just what it is. Honda doesn't have a big presence down here, so I don't have, an extensive experience of people that have run Hondas up that high. Maybe in the north they have. I don't know. I just don't have that experience with them because I live in South Florida and they're not that popular down here. So I would go with the 150. It's a great boat. I think they're awesome. Only complaint that I would have is the live wells in the floor. I just have never been a fan of that. And, I understand why it is, but that's just my only complaint outside of that. Now, Robbie Howell says, do you think changing spark plugs slightly earlier than required would reduce carbon deposits over the life of an engine due to fouled spark plugs not burning quite as efficiently? Well, I think that most of the maintenance schedules that all the brands have put out there, they've all done extensive research and development in their maintenance schedules. By and large, all of them have you changing spark plugs around 300 hours. And so I don't think if you change your spark plugs at, say, 250, you're going to lessen the amount of carbon deposits that you have in the engine. Carbon is mainly built on fouled spark plugs, yes, but if you do a lot of trolling, a lot of idling and stuff like that, if you never get your engine up to temperature, that's when you're going to build a lot of carbon up. And if you are having an issue with building carbon or you're concerned about building carbon, before I went and changed spark plugs, especially now, some spark plugs are $15, $20 a pop. So if you've got $15, $20 on, say, a 6-cylinder, you've got 120, 160 on an 8-cylinder. So, it could get kind of expensive. You got 2 engines, depending on what you've got, that could get a little bit expensive just for saving 150 hours. Instead of doing that, what I would recommend you do is just run ring-free or quick clean. If you have a Yamaha, run Yamaha ring-free. Phenomenal product. I think it works great. There's thousands of people out there that swear by it. I've seen great results with it, and it's the same thing with Mercury's Quick Clean. They're two really, really good products that they're fairly inexpensive for what they are. Ring Free's a little bit more pricey, and then now, of course, being August in 2024, everything's more expensive. It's like doubled, but outside of that, yeah, carbon, I don't think I would go into changing spark plugs early. I would just run a Ring Free or Quick Clean and forget about it. And also, if you're never getting your engine up to temperature or running wide open throttle, try and start running a little bit of wide open throttle every now and then to get your RPM up, get the heat up, and burn that carbon off. Frankie Dorr says, question for you. The lights on the side of my trailer, are they just running lights or do they have to blink? Also, thanks for the video. That's a decent question, Frankie. So, no, they shouldn't. You can make them blink if you would like them to blink, but should they? No, not really. Most of the trailer lights on the sides, they're just running lights. They're just going to be a yellow or an orange. That's pretty much what they are. They're running lights. They're not for your turn signal. If you want to make them blink with your turn signal, you could do that, but not really necessary. Just an interesting question, though. Thank you, Frankie. Catfish Stalker Outdoors with 530. I think I got that right. Catfish Stalker Outdoors with 530. Oh, thanks for the video. Thank you, Catfish Stalker. I have a 2013 Mercury 115 horsepower on my pontoon. It takes me a little of moving the shifter around to find neutral so I can start the motor. Do you know if there is an adjustment available for that? Thank you. Yeah, it's in your cables. We've talked a lot about shifting lately, actually, but yeah, your control cables, there's just on the ends of the cable, there is an end inside the control box. It will be adjustable, and at the engine, it will be adjustable. Really, I would just try and do it at the engine first. That way you don't have to take your control box out of your boat, but take the cowling off the engine on your little shifter, your throttle control there. If you're talking about the shifter, I think that's what we're talking about, shifter. You just look at your shift shaft mechanism, and you're on a Mercury, you're probably gonna have a 10 millimeter nut on there. You take that 10 millimeter off, or it might have the clip thing on there. You just take that off, pull the cable out, because it's got a notch in it, and you'll be able to spin the end of that out. Or I mean, you just take that out and there'll be this little like knob on it, depending on what 2013, yeah, it should have a little knob on there. It should be a Gen 2. You got a little knob. You'll be able to spin that little knob around, and that will move that cable in or out based on whenever you put it back in. So it should just slide right in there to where your shift mechanism is in the neutral position. You can also do that at the front. I want to say that the front is adjustable, but off the top of my head, can't think of it. It's late in the day, so there is that. But yeah, at the back of the cable, the little knob, spin it back and forth, find neutral to where it'll just slide on it. And if it doesn't fix it, then you need a new control cable. Your control cable's just stretched. It's just time to do a replacement. Alan Foss says, I have a similar shift shaft. After changing my water pump, when I put the lower end back in, my tranny won't shift forward, neutral, or reverse. I know the top is shifting when I looked in the top end and went through all 3 gears. Could it be because it's pushing it up or not engaging, or what? Generally when this happens, I'm going to say that you just missed the shift shaft. You know, generally there might be something else going on there, but by and large, 9 times out of 10, if you take your lower unit off that was shifting fine and you put it back on, especially on a Yamaha, I'm not sure what type of engine you have, you didn't say, but yeah, if you put it back up there and it doesn't shift at all, most likely you just missed the shift shaft, which is very common because when you drop the lower unit, your shift shaft is like right here, and it's got a circle to where the shift shaft of the lower unit slides up into it. And you need to make sure it slides up in there. But when you pull it out, sometimes that shift shaft can fall down like this. So when you go to put it back up, the shift shaft's laying right here, you push it back up, and it just sits on the side of it. There could be other reasons why it's not shifting, but by and large, that is 9 times out of 10 the most common one. And you just need to kind of make sure when you lift it up, you put a screwdriver or something up in there, move the shift shaft over to where it'll connect with the shift shaft, slide the lower unit back up in there, and you're usually golden after that. Pretty common. I mean, unless there is something else going on, there very well could be, but by and large, it's the shift shaft. LV7 Wade says, why not a valve job? So this video this is a comment off a video where we had a Mercury Verado. It was about a 2012 300, and it had a poor leak down, had a running issue. It basically had a head gasket that was leaking. So we pulled the head gasket, we pulled the head off the engine, changed the head gasket, cleaned out some of the valves and cleaned out some of the cylinders, which the carbon. And then when we went to put it back on there was a leak in the exhaust dump in the adapter plate that we filled with JB Weld. So the reason that we didn't do the valve job is that we wanted to use the boat that weekend. This happened on a Friday, and then on that Friday night, we pulled the boat out of the water. On Saturday, we came in, we pulled the power head off the engine, we pulled the head off, we cleaned it all up, we put everything back together, and then put it back in the water the next day. So we did all this in one day, and the adapter plate, again, this engine had like 1,500 hours on it, I want to say, and the adapter plate, in order to replace that, would have taken another few days worth of work, and the valve job on the head, they wasn't as bad as it looked. So we put everything back together, and then we put another 800 hours on that engine, and this was like a year ago, and then we repowered the boat. So the reason that we didn't do a valve job is that for the amount of money and time, the boat would have been down while the valve job was getting done, or while we were waiting on the valves and all the other stuff. And then also the amount of money that you would have to put in to do the valve job. And then also to put it all back together, rip the time to rip the adapter plate off of the engine and put a new one on there, and the cost of doing that. So if you would have added up all that downtime with the boat, downtime with the engines, waiting on the stuff to be done, paying for the valves, paying for the adapter plate, putting it all back together, it would have been like a 2-week process, and it would have cost a couple grand. Instead, we just cleaned it all up, did it in a day, changed the head gasket, fixed the issue, JB welded where the water is, because JB Weld's going to hold that water pressure on the exhaust. There's like no pressure there, maybe 20, 30 pounds of pressure. So you've got literally no pressure there. So the JB Weld's going to hold the water. It's not going to be an issue. It's not going to fail. And then we use that engine for another year for 800 hours and then repowered the boat. So opposed to not having a boat for 2 to 3 weeks, spending a couple $1,000s, we spent $300 in one day and used the boat for another year before repowering. So the whole reason of not doing a valve job is because we didn't want to waste the couple $1,000 and we didn't want to have no boat for 3 weeks. That's kind of why that is. But, you know, I get it. That's part of making videos and showing people things that you do, especially when you can do things yourself. A lot of times the value of time isn't noticeable to somebody that doesn't do this. Like if you are working on boats all day, every day, and you're always on a boat and you're always around boats, then for us, I mean, we're constantly going through boats, constantly going through engines. So to spend a few $1,000s and try and make a 2012 engine like you want to get 4 or 5 years out of it, that's not really a big deal, because that boat actually is now getting a new set of 400s on it this week. So it's kind of, we roll through stuff, and for $300 to get another 800 hours out of the engine, it doesn't weigh out, as far as I'm concerned, to waste 3 weeks of time and a couple grand for an engine that's maybe worth $4,000 or $5,000. T. Gizzard says, is there an easier way to flush Mercuries? There's probably a lot of people out there that have this complaint about a Mercury and flushing them, and mainly because like V6s and V8s, when you go to take the flush thing out, the hose is like this long, and sometimes you cannot get that plug out without getting pliers out and having to score it up to yank it out. So yeah, I would look into getting a Flushmaster system. We actually have a few things going on with Flushmasters that don't have the videos done yet, but there are some content coming out with them. It's an automatic flushing system that you can either have portable or you can put it on your dock. You basically put your water hose to the system, tell it how long you want it to be on for, and they have quick connects that you put on your engine. So all you have to do is put the quick connects on your engine and you click them on there, turn them, quarter turn, hit the start button, and then it automatically flushes your engine. I think it's a really good thing, because for people that don't really flush your engine, you really should, especially if you want to get a long time out of it. Like, you know, if you're not like us that are going through engines and boats all the time, then you want to get 20, 30 years out of your engine, out of your boats, with the least amount of problems possible. Then flushing it is something that you're going to want to do. And so something like this, where for a couple $100, you just put it on your boat, you put it to the water hose, quick connects, and push the start button, and it automatically flushes your engine out and turns off when the timer goes off. I think that's probably the easiest thing that I've seen for somebody to be able to flush their engine by far. Ray Foshup, have an issue with a 2013 Mercury 40 horsepower EFI where the motor will die if I don't squeeze the primer bulb, brand new bulb and fuel filters. Well, Ray, you've got something else going on. It's not really your primer bulb. It's not really your fuel filter. So either your low pressure pump's going bad or your 40 horsepower EFI, pretty sure that has a diaphragm pump on it. So either something's going on with that, or you've got a restriction somewhere that is not allowing that pump to pull the fuel. It's like a telltale sign when you've got to sit there and squeeze your primer bulb to keep the engine running. What you're doing is you're acting like the low pressure pump. You're feeding fuel to the engine to keep it running. And when you stop feeding it, it doesn't run anymore. You are taking the place of your low pressure fuel pump. And so you've got either an issue with that pump, or you've got a restriction to where that pump can't get the fuel. And since you've put new fuel filters on there and a brand new primer bulb, as if the primer bulb is not going stuck, then most likely your issue is not from the primer bulb to your fuel tank, but from your primer bulb to the engine itself, like to the fuel pump. So somewhere in there, maybe in the rigging tube, that fuel line is probably kinked or something like that, to where it's not allowing the lift pump, because it's only going to have like 2 to 4 inches of mercury of vacuum that it can create in order to pull that fuel up to your engine. So my guess is you've got something going on there, whether that be the bad pump or a restriction. You need to investigate that fuel line from your primer bulb up to your low pressure pump, and maybe even take that pump off there and investigate, see if what's going on with it. You didn't say that there's a running issue, so most likely the diaphragm isn't ruptured, because not sure if a 2013 40 horsepower EFI runs off of a lobe or crankcase pressure. I want to say it's a lobe, but I'm not 100% sure. William Lutch says we are headed to Florida in a year, and I will have saved up a bit for a used 20-foot to 23-foot bay/offshore boat, something like Key West 2019 FS, Mako 214cc, or a Seafox 228. Years 2019 to 2022. Is it bad if I'm looking for least amount of hours? What is too high, or is there such thing as too low? Is there such a thing as too low? We are in Denver and can't see the boats till I move there, using web to learn as much as I can. That's a great question, William. I'm sure there are tons of people in that same situation where you're looking for a boat. Maybe it's long distance. You can't go look at the boat, or the boat's a couple hours away. So out of those three models, my favorite is probably going to be the Key West 219 FSS or FS. The Mako 214 center console, Seafox 228. I'd probably put them in that order. I'd like the Key West, then the Mako, then the Seafox. But as far as a 2019 to 2022, so the years that you have picked are, we're talking 5 years to 3 years old, or 2 years. Now we're getting almost to the end of 2024, but so 2 to 5 year old boats and engines, my guess is either one, they're going to have a lot of hours, or either two, they're not going to have a lot of hours. I would say anything under 500 would be normal. So if someone is using your boat regularly in Florida, I would say 100 hours a year is pretty normal. So at 5 years, they would have probably 500 hours on the boat if they were using it regularly. There may be some people that are using it more than that, but my guess is that you're going to see most of these boats being a Key West, the Mako, the Seafox. Those three models are more, I wouldn't say that those are models that you have people that are going out all the time. Not to say that they don't. I'm sure there's tons of people that have these similar models, but my look and my opinion of the models is that most likely you're going to find these boats between those years being around, 200 to 300 hours on the boat. Most likely the people that are selling them got into them 2019, 2022. They've owned them since they were new. They've had them for 4 years, and they are probably upgrading to a new boat, or they are trying to get out of boating. In those would probably be your two situations for those models. So my guess is 100 to 300 hours is probably going to be what most of these boats are going to be running. Even if they had 500 hours on the engines, I don't think you're going to see a problem with it. And also because these boats, most of them are going to be running a 150. Some of them might have a 175 or a 200. That 228 Seafox might have a 200 on it, but the 219 and the 214 most likely has a 150 or a 200. Either way, just like we were talking about earlier, that 150, Yamaha, Mercury, Suzuki, doesn't matter. I've seen them with thousands and thousands of hours. So if you get a 2021 Key West with a Yamaha F-150 with 250 hours on it, or even 500, let's say it's got 500 hours on it. That engine, 500 hours on a Yamaha F-150, that thing is just broke in. Like you got so much life left of that engine that it's not even funny. So I would not be concerned about anything. Now, if that engine's got, say, 3,000 hours on it, that means that boat was probably used commercially, and that engine was probably run pretty hard, and that it might not have been flushed. So, that's whenever you get into what's the lifestyle that that engine had and what kind of abuse was it suffering during that time. Like if it's a commercial boat and has 3,000 hours on it in say 2 to 3 years, that engine probably wasn't ever flushed and it probably got beat up a lot, because in order to get that amount of time on there, you're going out all the time. Irregardless of the weather, you're going out when it's sloppy, you're going out when it's good, because you're running it all the time. When people want to go out, you're chartering. So if you get that many hours on it, that might be a little bit concerning. Other than that, no, I think those are 3 good models. I think that the engine, you shouldn't have anything to worry about as far as too little or too high. Most likely, most of those boats that are for sale are, again, going to be under 500 hours on them. The Nuts and Bolts says, I traded an electric oven for a 1987 Yamaha Big Bear 4-wheeler. That sounds like a good deal. That's a good deal. I ride with a friend who has a $32,000 side-by-side. I have a $4,000 2000 Key West with an undersized 60 horsepower Merc. I go to the lake with a friend who has a $140,000 wakeboard boat. I call it representing. The poor man can do what the rich man can do, but just not as fast. I like that statement. I like that. You can do what they can do. You just can't go as fast. And even that, I mean, $140,000 wakeboard boat, that's not even top of the line. Nowadays, when we're at the boat show and stuff like that, you look at these Malibus, these Mastercrafts, these Centurions, the Ski Nautiques. I mean, these wakeboard boats are $400,000. It's crazy. So $140,000 wakeboard boat, yeah, the $4,000 Key West is going to get you on the lake, and you're going to be having just as much fun as they are. So I agree with you. If you can get out on the water, get out on the water, and then don't be ashamed of what gets you out there. As long as it gets you back. That's important. One Fine 69C. I'm not even sure if the Yamahas are bad, but I don't like HPDIs just because of the high amount of pressure. It just doesn't seem to me that high pressure anything warrants reliability. I mean, I don't know if I could say that. I think the 150-200 Yamaha HPDI was a super reliable engine. The 3.3 250, 300s, maybe a little less reliable, but most of those HPDIs, the real problem and killer to an HPDI was poor fuel and lack of use. So if you got poor fuel or you're using ethanol, which is a really hard decision to make unless you're burning it all up. If you're using your boat normally and you fill your tank up once every, say, month or 2 months, then ethanol is a terrible choice. So most of the time, dirty fuel, old fuel, ethanol, that poor fuel quality is what killed most of the HPDIs. It wasn't that it was just unreliable, and not to mention that the 425 and the 450, the XTOs, those are direct injection too. And those things have almost double the amount of pressure as the HPDI did. At wide open throttle, the XTO's doing like, what is it, 2,800 to 3,200 PSI. So it's way more pressure, but yeah, it's poor fuel quality. That's the biggest problem that HPDI had, was poor fuel quality and people just letting them sit. Because when they sat, that's when everything's just sitting there rusting. It's not good. So lack of maintenance, just like the other guy said the other week. What did he say? He said, Yamahas don't die, they're murdered from maintenance. That's a true statement. Uwu says, I have an 07 225 Yamaha and it runs rough at idle or dies, but only on the way back to the dock, not going out. That is interesting. So I don't know exactly if I'm reading it wrong or if the way you're saying it is very difficult, because you don't give us a lot of information here. So basically what you're saying is it runs rough at idle or dies, but only on the way back to the dock, not going out. So that means we got an engine here. You got a 225 07. So we're talking about an old F225 with the individual throttle bodies, the old girl, 3.3. So we got a Yamaha 4-stroke, runs, idles, and gets wide open throttle. Everything runs perfect. No issues. It is awesome when you're leaving and running around. Now, whenever you turn around and head back to the dock, now all of a sudden it runs rough at idle and dies. I don't know about that. You're probably trying to say that well, basically the engine doesn't want to go home. That's a problem here. You want to go home, but the Yamaha wants to stay out. So honestly, I think what the problem is most likely is temperature at idle. So those 225s somewhere in there on the fuel line in the VST is a relief valve. It's like a recirculation relief valve thing. I would be looking into that, and it could potentially be a temperature problem. But any of those 07 225 run rough at idle and dies is most likely that relief valve is messed up. So I'd be looking at that. Ooh, based on the information. Matthew Sharp says, what does it entail adding an offshore bracket in regards to the fuel lines, power and data cables, hydraulic steering lines, etc.? Is there an easy way of extending them or have to run new? So this is a phenomenal question. Now, honestly, you would generally want to run new. And the reason I say that is because if you put extensions on there, technically, yeah, you can extend everything. But for the most part, depending on the engine and the rigging, most of them have extension harnesses. Mercury's got extension harnesses. Yamaha's got extension harnesses. Most of them, you can extend your harness from, the back of the boat to the back of the engine once you push it 2 feet back. But same thing for your cables. Your fuel lines, you would really just run a new fuel line from your water separator bracket to the engine. I wouldn't necessarily put a splice in there, but you could splice the fuel line. You could put power posts, attach your battery cables to the power posts at the transom, and then run new cables from there to the engine. You could run the extension harnesses for your main harness from the transom to the engine. You can put butt connectors and splicers or couplers in your steering hoses and add 3 feet of steering hose there. So yeah, pretty much everything could be spliced and put back there. But now all of a sudden, depending on the situation, your transom and the type of boat you got, you have now added failure points to every single one of those items. Like, if you put the splice in the fuel line, there's a failure point for an issue. There's a point for corrosion, for a blockage, for an air leak. Your data harness, you can get water on that data harness. It could get into that connection. That coupler could fail. The connection could fail. Where it goes together, that could fail. The power posts, now you've got power posts in the back that are going to be corroding. It's exposed to the weather, so that's a failure point. Your hydraulic lines, now you've got a coupler there. That is a failure point. So realistically, you would want to run new, but technically, yes, you could put extensions on there and make it work. Again, depending on the transom situation, if you can get them in a dry location to where they're going to be protected and it's not going to be an issue, then the extension is probably not a big deal, especially the fuel line. There's no reason to put a splice on a fuel line when you've probably got a water separator bracket right there, and opposed to just adding 3 feet of fuel hose, why wouldn't you just get 5-6 feet of fuel hose and just run a new one from your water separator bracket? Totally understand the battery cables though, running from the front to the back. And, now you got to run 25 feet plus of battery cables at $150 a roll. So, or $100 a roll, depending on what you get. So yeah. And then an extension harness, your extension harness is probably going to be, depending on the brand, could be $100, could be a couple $100. So the steering hoses, you're going to have to buy the couplers, and you're going to have to buy 3 feet steering hoses, or depending on the type of hydraulic steering you have, you could just get, you can make the hoses. So by the time you add all that up, it might be easier to add new. So, yes, you can extend them. Do you want to? Maybe, maybe not. Randy DeVoe, my only suggestion to any marine engine owner, do not buy motor brand oil. Example, Yamalube. Yamaha is not an oil company. Use only AMS oil for everything, engine and gear. So I'm not an oil expert either. I'm not an oil expert. I generally try to run name brand like stuff, but I totally understand most of it's all white labeled. Yamaha, like you said, is not an oil company. They are a engine man. Well, Yamaha's everything. They make everything. Yamaha makes, ATVs and jet skis and pianos and guitars and amps and motors, like outboards. They make everything. So wave runners, they make boats. Like, Yamaha makes everything. So the oil, AMSOIL, I don't know. I think it's a great oil, but I don't really know that much about. I've never really gotten into doing oil analyses and all that kind of stuff. I know AMSOIL is one of the top people love AMSOIL, and then there's other ones like RevX and some other ones that make excellent lubricants. So it's an interesting statement there, Randy. Interesting statement. All right, last question from Candido Ramirez. I have a 1999 Yamaha 150 two-stroke, and I'm having an overheating issue. I recently changed my impeller and brand new thermostats. The engine has a strong P-stream. I even changed my head gaskets and water jackets, and it still has the overheating alarm going off. I confirmed it was overheating with a laser thermostat. I saw your video about Ridlime. Hopefully it does the trick. Any other suggestions / advice? So you've pretty much gone through everything. The only thing that I would also be looking at is the water tube going up to the engine. That's always seems to be forgotten, but sometimes has problems. And then you didn't say anything about the poppet valve. So potentially the poppet valve is not either it's stuck open or whatever. It could be messed up in either direction. So I'd be looking at the poppet valve, and then I'd be looking at that water tube. And then the Ridlime's outstanding. So depending on where you hit it with the laser thermostat, you look at that and see where the hot spot is. Like, is it a hot spot and this side's cooling? Because if you did your heads and you did your water jackets, like just changing the gaskets aren't really anything, but the only reason you change your gaskets because you clean the heads and you clean your water jackets. So most likely your water jacket's going to be running cool if you've got water flow. If it's not running cool, then you ain't got water flow, which would lead me to the water tube or the poppet valve where you're just losing all your water. So those are the two things that I'd be looking at. The only other advice that I would have are those two things. Poppet valve, the Ridline would be good, but the water jacket, or not the water jacket, but the water tube going from the impeller to the block, because if that's got a problem, then your impeller is just throwing the water up and it's just going out the water tube.